In the beginning, before the first photograph was ever taken, before the family learned to smile on command, there was a silence that clung to their land like a second skin. It wasn't the peaceful kind of silence. It was the type that feels like someone else is breathing in the room with you, slowly, deliberately, just outside the corner of your eye. And if you're hearing this now, it means you've stepped across a line the world was never meant to cross. Because this family, this bloodline, was never supposed to be spoken of again. Not after what happened. Not after what they buried. People used to say the house was built on bad ground. Soil that refused to grow anything worth harvesting. Soil that felt wrong beneath your boots. But the truth is, the ground wasn't bad. It was simply tired. Tired of swallowing secrets no one should ever carry. And the first secret it consumed was the family's true origin. An origin too fractured and violent for the early townsfolk to keep written in any church ledger or county record. They erased it the way people erase a stain they're afraid to admit came from their own hands. The family themselves learned early that silence was safer than truth. Their father taught them that, a man who spoke with the calmness of a preacher, but punished like someone trying to carve obedience into bone. He told his children that the world outside didn't need to know them, that they were meant to be unseen, unquestioned. And he kept them close, too close, inside walls that echoed with things neighbors would pretend they never heard. But the strangest thing wasn't the father. It wasn't the mother, either, though she moved like someone living in a memory she couldn't escape. No, the strangest thing was the way the children would stare out the upstairs windows at night. Not at the sky, not at the road, but at the trees, as if waiting for them to move, as if they had seen them move before. For years the town told itself stories to explain the family away. That they were reclusive, that they were strange, that some people are just born different. But buried beneath those comfortable lies was something darker, something the town feared too much to name. And now, piece by piece, we're going to lift the lid on what they tried so hard to forget. They say every family carries a shadow, but this one, theirs wasn't behind them. It walked beside them, it grew with them. And by the time the youngest child turned 7, the shadow had already begun shaping the story the town would spend generations trying to outrun. It started with the noises from the barn, not the usual groans of timber or the restless shifting of livestock. These sounds were different, wet, rhythmic, almost like something breathing against the walls. The father would leave the house at odd hours to tend to it, though no one ever saw him bring in feed or tools. And when he returned, his hands trembled as if something inside the barn had reminded him who was truly in control. He never spoke about what he kept in there, not to his wife, not to his children. But the mother would press her fingers to her lips whenever they asked, as though she feared the walls themselves were listening. The children weren't supposed to go near it. They were told the barn was dangerous, unstable, ready to collapse. But lies like that don't work on curious blood, especially not blood raised on fear. So one night, the eldest daughter, the one neighbors always swore had eyes too old for her face, snuck out with a candle stub and a stolen key. She opened the door just long enough to look inside. Long enough to see something that should have shattered her mind. But she didn't scream. She didn't run. She just closed the door softly, as if trying not to disturb whatever was slumped inside. After that night, she stopped speaking altogether. Not a single word for months. The father blamed illness. The doctor blamed nerves. The pastor said the devil had brushed her shoulder. But the brother, 2 years younger and half as fearful, noticed something no one else did. She no longer looked out at the trees. She looked at the barn instead. Not with curiosity, but with recognition, as if she understood it now, as if she knew what it wanted. And then the animals began disappearing. A hog 1 week, 2 goats the next, then the dogs. The family buried the empty collars behind the house, pretending they didn't hear the scratching that sometimes echoed from the barn long after midnight. And still, the father kept insisting everything was fine, perfectly normal. Just the wind, just the wolves, just imagination. But every man in town knew the truth: wolves don't open doors. And the wind doesn't drag bodies. The final straw came on a night the town would later call the Hollowing, though no one agreed on who first used the name. What they did agree on was this: the air felt wrong, heavy, expectant, like the land itself was holding its breath. The mother was the first to notice the change. She stood at the window long after sunset, her fingers tightening around the curtain as the wind combed through the fields in long, unnatural waves. The crops bent in perfect unison, as if answering a command no human ear could hear. When she whispered her husband's name, he didn't come. He was already outside, walking toward the barn with a lantern that flickered like it was afraid. Inside the house, the children huddled together. Not out of fear. By then, fear had become an old companion, but because of something else. Something deeper. They said they could hear a sound beneath the wind, a low hum resonating through the floorboards. It vibrated up their legs, settling in their chests like a second heartbeat. The youngest boy covered his ears. The daughter, the silent one, simply stared toward the barn, her expression blank, almost peaceful. What happened next was never officially recorded. Not in the sheriff's notes, not in the church logs, not even in the whispered stories passed between families at the diner. But fragments survived, bits and pieces, enough to create a shape, the way shadows sometimes reveal more than light ever could. The lantern went out before the father reached the barn door. Witnesses said they saw it wink out like a dying star, swallowed by the dark. The mother screamed his name and ran after him, but she didn't make it halfway across the yard before she froze. Not stopped frozen, as if something held her spine in its grip. Her pupils widened, her mouth fell slack, and she collapsed without a sound. From inside the barn came a single, sharp cry. Not pain, not fear, recognition, like something waking up and calling for a belong to it. Then the door opened by itself. What stepped out wasn't seen clearly, not by any living soul. The town agreed on only two details. It was tall, and it moved like it had been waiting a very, very long time. The children didn't run, they didn't scream, they moved toward it, all of them, as though answering a summons carried in their blood. By morning, the barn was empty, so was the house. The only sign they had ever been there were the footprints, small, bare, perfectly lined, leading into the woods, and none of them led back out. By dawn, the woods had swallowed every trace of them except the footprints, and even those seemed to fade as the sun rose, as if the earth was ashamed to hold their memory. The sheriff organized a search party, though every man who stepped toward that tree line felt the same thing, a pressure, subtle at first, then tightening like an unseen hand pressing against the center of the chest. Some called it anxiety. Others called it God's warning. But the eldest man in the group, a veteran of a war the country pretends it won, said it reminded him of the silence before an ambush. When the branches themselves seemed to lean closer, listening, they pushed in anyway. Pride makes fools of men, especially when fear dares them to turn back. The deeper they went, the stranger the forest became. Trees of the same species grew in crooked, unnatural angles, as though bending away from some invisible center. The ground dipped in shallow patterns shaped like ribs, and occasionally a searcher would swear he saw impressions in the soil that resembled fingers. Long ones, about a mile in, they found the first sign the family had passed through. A piece of the mother's dress hung from a branch, though no branch in sight was low enough to snag it. The fabric wasn't torn, it was sliced clean and straight, as if removed with something sharper than steel. A few yards farther, they found the father's belt buckle pressed into the mud, bent slightly, as if crushed by a weight it was never meant to bear. That's when the humming started. It began faintly, too low to be wind, too steady to be birds. A rhythmic pulse, like something alive but distant. Some men turned their heads, swearing the sound came from behind them. Others insisted it came from ahead, deeper into the forest. A few whispered that it came from inside their skulls. The sheriff told everyone to stay calm, but he kept wiping sweat from his palms, even though the air was cold enough to frost. They found no bodies, no blood, no footprints beyond that first stretch. It was as if the family had simply dissolved into the woods. But they did find one thing, the daughter's candle stub, the same one she had held the night she opened the barn. It was still warm. The sheriff ordered everyone back. He claimed it was for safety, but the truth was simpler. The forest didn't want them there. And every second they lingered, it pressed tighter, like lungs filling with smoke. When they emerged, pale and shaken, they made a pact, one they never wrote down, but every man honored. They would not speak of what they heard. They would not return, and they would not let their children wander too close to that tree line. Because some families disappear, but others become something else. Years passed, but the land never healed. The empty house leaned deeper into itself, boards curling inward like a body trying to protect a wound that would never close. Kids dared each other to run up to the porch at night, but no one ever stepped inside. Not because of ghosts. Ghosts would have been a comfort. What people feared was the feeling that the family hadn't left at all, only changed shape. Hunters reported seeing figures in the woods at dusk, too tall to be deer and too quiet to be human. They moved in smooth, deliberate motions, as if gliding rather than walking. And whenever someone tried to follow, the forest closed in, branches knitting together overhead, swallowing the world in a darkness that didn't care whether it was noon or midnight. A few hunters swore they heard laughter, not mocking, not cruel, but familiar. The kind of laughter you'd hear at a dinner table before a father raised his voice. Rumors spread. Some said the family had become part of the land, bound to the soil that had once rejected them. Others believed something ancient had claimed them, reshaping them into disciples of whatever had slumbered beneath the barn for generations. But the oldest people in town whispered a different theory entirely, one the younger folk dismissed until the day they found evidence. Behind the house, near the line where the yard met the trees, the ground used to be peppered with buried collars, the graves of the family's animals. But around the 10th anniversary of the hollowing, something changed. The dirt shifted, the graves rose into uneven mounds, and on one cold October morning, all the collars were gone, every single one. No tracks, no signs of digging, just the outlines where they used to be. And on the porch, arranged in a perfect circle, were 12 small imprints, child-sized, bare. After that, the town gave up on explanations. They simply avoided the place. They didn't hunt near it, didn't camp near it, didn't even say the family name out loud. It was as if the entire community agreed to pretend the woods were a scar on the map. Something to cover, not something to understand. But there's a truth buried beneath all that silence. Something only a handful of people are willing to say. The family never died. They were never killed. They answered a call older than the town, older than the country, older than anything their bloodline could ever outrun. And if you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? The truth is, the town's silence didn't save anyone. It only bought time. Because silence doesn't bury history, it ferments it. And by the time the next generation grew up, the land around that abandoned house began to change in ways no one could ignore. Not violently, not suddenly, just wrong. It started with the trees. Their bark darkened, taking on a texture too smooth, almost like skin. Branches curled downward instead of up, as if listening. And every fall, when the leaves should have turned and dropped, they clung to the branches like they were afraid of hitting the ground. Hikers who wandered too close described the same sensation of faint warmth on the back of the neck, like being watched from a few inches away. Not by a predator, not by a person, by something that remembered them. That's when the stories resurfaced. Stories about a lineage cursed long before the family ever built that house. Stories about a pact struck in secret. One that promised safety from outsiders in exchange for devotion to whatever lived beneath the soil. It was said that each generation was forbidden to leave. That if they tried, the land would take back what was owed. Neighbors dismissed it as folklore, old world superstition brought over by settlers who trusted fear more than God. But the deeper researchers dug into county history, the more they uncovered missing branches in the family line. Births without death certificates. Children listed in ledgers, then erased a year later without explanation. And then came the recordings. A group of amateur paranormal investigators, teenagers with more confidence than sense, snuck onto the property one night with cheap cameras and a borrowed EMF meter. They lasted 37 minutes. When they came running back into town, they weren't screaming or crying. They were whispering. Whispering the same phrase over and over, voices trembling. It knew our names. But the footage they brought back was mostly static, the cameras glitching whenever pointed toward the tree line. But one 10-second clip survived. In the distance at the edge of the woods, a figure stood between the trees, thin, motionless, arms too long, and just before the clip cut out, the figure tilted its head, the same way the father used to when someone asked a question he didn't like. Experts wrote it off as pareidolia, overexposure, artifacts. But the townsfolk didn't need explanations. They had seen the same posture before. In the man who raised his children to fear the outside world. In the man who walked willingly into the dark that night. Some said it was him, others said it wasn't him anymore. But the truth, that figure wasn't watching the camera. It wasn't watching the boys. It was waiting. Some historians believe that when a story refuses to die, it's because it isn't finished. It lingers, unfinished business stitched into the fabric of a place. And in this case, that unfinished business grew teeth. Because on the 50th anniversary of the hollowing, long after most of the original townspeople were gone, something surfaced. Not an attack, not a sighting, something quieter, more precise. The kind of event that leaves a deeper mark than violence ever could. A new family moved into the county. Outsiders. They bought a cheap parcel of land along the old road, unaware that the neglected farmhouse a quarter-mile away wasn't abandoned by choice. They had a daughter, 12 years old, bright, curious, the kind of child who explores first and asks permission later. It didn't take long before she found the path leading into the woods. It was faint now, softened by decades of leaves, but still there, a line worn into the earth by small bare feet. At school, she told her teacher about the children she kept seeing near the trees. The teacher laughed, assuming she meant wildlife. Kids make up stories, everyone knows that. But the girl insisted they weren't animals. She said they looked like children her age, only quiet, too quiet. Their faces were blurry, she whispered. Like they didn't finish growing. One morning, the girl didn't show up to class. Her parents assumed she'd missed the bus and stayed home. But the house was empty when they returned from work. Lights on, backpack by the door, doors still locked from the inside. The police found her footprints behind the house, leading straight toward the old woods. Smaller prints followed beside them, dozens of them, bare, perfectly spaced, and none of them broke stride. For 3 days the search continued. They brought dogs, drones, thermal imaging. But technology is useless against a forest that learned long ago how to hide what it wants to keep. No heat signatures, no movement, no sign of struggle. Only that same faint pressure on the chest, the same hum beneath the soil, the same feeling of being watched by something that remembers your blood even if you don't remember its. On the 4th night, a storm hit, lightning tearing the sky open like a wound. And just after midnight, a farmer driving home spotted a figure at the side of the road, a child, standing perfectly still in the rain. He stopped the truck, called out, waved a flashlight. The girl didn't respond. When he stepped closer, he realized why. It wasn't her. The figure was taller, thinner, arms too long, head slightly tilted, rain sliding off its skin the way it slides off bark, and in the split second before it stepped backward into the trees, he saw something that froze him where he stood, small hands gripping its back. 12 of them, pale, clinging like branches to a trunk. After that night, the town accepted what they had always suspected: the family hadn't vanished. They had multiplied, spread through the forest like roots, watching, waiting, growing. And the truth you were never supposed to hear is this: some bloodlines don't end. They adapt. They return to the soil that shaped them. They become part of the land, and the land remembers everyone who trespasses. If you ever find yourself on a back road at dusk, with trees bending just a little too close, don't stop. Don't stare. Don't listen for footsteps behind you. Because the family the world was never meant to see has been waiting for someone new.